You don't rule Sparta alone. You never do. Even as king, you are watched. There are always two kings in Sparta, drawn from rival royal houses, meant to restrain each other. And standing above them both are 5 ephors, ordinary citizens elected for a single year, empowered to summon, fine, exile, or destroy the men who wear the crown. This is what Spartan kingship actually looks like. Not command, exposure. That is why the door closing behind Cleomenes' wife matters. No guards strike him, no crowd gathers. There is no drama worthy of a king. Inside the small room, Cleomenes stands alone, a man who has led armies and broken cities, now waiting to be judged, not by another king, but by 5 officials who hold no crowns at all. They do not accuse him of treason. They do not accuse him of failure in war. Instead, they accuse him of madness. In Sparta, that charge is enough. Madness does not require witnesses. It does not require proof beyond doubt. It only requires agreement that a king has become dangerous to the system built to contain him. Cleomenes is confined. Later sources say he is chained. Not long after, he is found dead, his body mutilated, his end officially explained as the work of his own unstable mind. There is no revolt. No royal faction rises. The city does not pause. Sparta moves on. That silence is not apathy. It is design. This is not the story of a coup or a revolution. It is the story of a society that survived by making its kings unsafe. Sparta did not trust its rulers. It watched them, and when watching was no longer enough, it removed them. By the end of this story, you'll understand why holding the title of king in Sparta was not a safeguard, but a permanent risk. Why power there came with exposure, not protection. Like and subscribe if you want more exploring history this way. Then drop a comment. I genuinely enjoy reading where you're all tuning in from around the world. Next, Cleomenes' death was not an accident of personality. It was the outcome of structure. Sparta's kings ruled by birth, but not by right alone. From the beginning, their authority was conditional, renewed annually, watched constantly, and always vulnerable to removal. There were 2 kings at all times, drawn from rival royal houses. That alone ensured that no single man could claim the state as his own. Yet the deeper restraint came from elsewhere. 5 ephors, elected each year from the citizen body, stood alongside the kings in every sphere that mattered. They summoned assemblies. They controlled legal proceedings. They could fine kings, put them on trial, exile them, or strip them of authority outright. Cleomenes knew this when he came to power. He also believed at first that success might protect him. Early in his reign, he led campaigns far beyond Sparta's borders, forcing rival cities into submission and extending Spartan influence across the Peloponnese. In practical terms, his actions worked. Cities complied. Enemies hesitated. Allies deferred. That visibility brought scrutiny. At one point, Cleomenes was accused of accepting bribes, an allegation serious enough to bring him before Spartan authorities. The charge did not end his rule. He was acquitted, but the trial itself mattered more than the verdict. It established something publicly and unmistakably. A Spartan king could be summoned, accused, and judged like any other official. After that moment, every decision Cleomenes made carried a second audience. Not the enemy in the field, the ephors at home. When he delayed a campaign, it could be framed as caution or as incompetence. When he acted decisively, it could be praised or interpreted as ambition. Religion offered him temporary shelter. Cleomenes learned to justify his actions through omens and oracles, delaying or advancing campaigns according to divine signs rather than personal choice. For a time, that strategy worked, because religion was one of the few domains the ephors hesitated to challenge directly. Eventually, it stopped working. The final accusation did not focus on policy or military judgment. It attacked the foundation of kingship itself, fitness to rule. Once the ephors agreed that Cleomenes was unstable, procedure took over. There was no need for public debate, no need for a dramatic verdict. Confinement followed, then death. What mattered was not how Cleomenes died, but how easily the system absorbed his removal. Sparta did not fracture. It did not descend into factional violence. The mechanism functioned. That outcome taught a lesson far more powerful than any written law. A Spartan king could be removed without breaking the state. Royal blood did not guarantee safety. Success did not ensure survival. From this point forward, kingship in Sparta carried a clear, unspoken warning. Rule, but remain visible. Lead, but do not stand apart. Succeed, but never too independently. Cleomenes was not remembered as a martyr. He became a precedent, and once a system proves it can destroy a king quietly, it does not forget how to do it again. Cleomenes' removal did not calm Sparta's politics. It sharpened them. The city had learned something dangerous about itself. A king could be eliminated without civil war, without sacrilege, without even a public reckoning. Procedure had proven stronger than blood. That knowledge changed how power was handled next. Sparta always had two kings, drawn from separate royal houses. The arrangement is often described as balance. In practice, it became surveillance. Each king now ruled knowing that his counterpart was not simply a colleague, but a potential witness. Disagreement stopped being a debate. It became evidence. This tension hardened during the reign of Demaratus. Demaratus did not fail spectacularly. He did not lose an army or defy a law. His mistake was more ordinary and more threatening. He disagreed with his fellow king and with the ephors over how far Spartan authority could stretch beyond the Peloponnese. During campaigns in Asia Minor, Demaratus argued for restraint in dealing with allied Greek cities. Harsh punishment, he believed, would create enemies faster than obedience. His rival favored firmer control. The ephors listened closely. The disagreement did not end with a vote. It followed Demaratus home. Rather than challenge his strategy directly, the ephors attacked his legitimacy. They reopened an old question about his birth, claiming his mother had conceived him before marriage. The accusation mattered less for its plausibility than for its utility. Legitimacy in Sparta rested on ritual as much as lineage. If lineage could be questioned, kingship could be undone. The ephors consulted oracles. They presented testimony. They framed the issue not as political rivalry, but as religious uncertainty. In that space, Demaratus had little defense. The ruling stripped him of his throne. No guards dragged him away. No blood was spilled. Demaratus simply ceased to be king. He fled Sparta and eventually entered the service of the Persian court. Years later, a former Spartan king would advise the empire Sparta would soon face in open war. The consequences of that decision were immediate inside the city. Kings learned that lineage was not armor. They learned that procedure could reach backward in time, reopening questions thought long settled. More importantly, they learned that disagreement itself carried risk. From this point on, alignment mattered more than argument. A king who shared the ephors' instincts survived longer than one who challenged them, even quietly. The dual kingship, once meant to divide authority, now multiplied pressure. If one king came under suspicion, the other was forced into a choice: defend him and risk scrutiny, or remain silent and appear loyal to the system. Neither option was safe. The ephors did not need to invent crises. They waited for moments when kings disagreed publicly, then used those fractures as justification to intervene. The structure supplied its own pretext. As a result, royal behavior changed in observable ways. Kings began coordinating statements before assemblies. Disputes were delayed rather than aired. Campaign plans grew cautious, designed to leave as little room for reinterpretation as possible. None of this strengthened leadership. It protected survival. By the time Demaratus's exile became precedent, Sparta had crossed a threshold. Kingship was no longer a stabilizing institution. It was a conditional office, tolerated only so long as it remained predictable. The system had learned how to remove kings cleanly. What it had not yet learned was what repeated removal would do to trust, decisiveness, and command. That cost would surface later, when caution itself became a liability. After Demaratus was erased, the danger of kingship stopped being theoretical. It became personal. Every king now ruled with a memory in mind. what happened to the man before him, and how little resistance the system had faced in removing him. That awareness did not announce itself in speeches or decrees, it surfaced in behaviour. Summons from home arrived faster, reports were demanded in greater detail, religious observance was examined for errors that could be reinterpreted later. Command remained, but privacy vanished. The strain is visible in the career of Leotychides II. He inherited the throne after Demaratus, and understood exactly why that throne had been vacated. His rule began cautiously, shaped less by ambition than by calculation. In 479 BC, Leotychides led a Spartan force north into Thessaly. The campaign did not require pitched battle. Local elites offered cooperation in exchange for restraint. Leotychides accepted. The decision shortened the war and preserved manpower. It also created a paper trail. When he returned to Sparta, the ephors charged him with accepting bribes from Thessalian leaders. The accusation focused on conduct, not outcome. Victory was not in question. Judgment was. The procedure moved quickly. Evidence was presented. A fine was imposed, so large that it could not realistically be paid. Leotychides fled before further penalties could follow. Later accounts place him taking refuge in a temple, clinging to sacred ground in the hope that religion might slow what politics had already decided. It did not. His house was destroyed. His kingship ended. He died in exile. The lesson was precise and unsettling. A king could make a decision that worked, save lives, shorten a campaign, and still be ruined by how that decision could be framed after the fact. That realization narrowed the range of acceptable action for those who followed. Kings began shaping campaigns around how they would look in review rather than how they would unfold in the field. Negotiation became risky. Flexibility looked like opportunity for accusation. Delay, once a tool of strategy, started to resemble hesitation. None of this required new laws. Memory was enough. The personal cost compounded quickly. A Spartan king could not confide in generals whose careers depended on ephor approval. He could not rely on his fellow king, whose silence might be safer than solidarity. Even family ties became liabilities. Since lineage itself had already been used as a weapon, isolation followed command. This environment rewarded a specific temperament. Men who spoke cautiously lasted longer. Men who acted boldly drew attention. Over time, the office selected for restraint, bordering on invisibility. The state interpreted this as stability. From the outside, Sparta still appeared disciplined and unified. Armies marched, assemblies met, the rituals continued. Inside the kingship, however, confidence was thinning. Decisions slowed, initiative narrowed. Responsibility became something to survive rather than exercise. The system did not register this as damage. Each removal looked clean. Each exile appeared contained. No riot followed. No sacred taboo was violated. Yet the cumulative effect was measurable. Allies began hedging their commitments, unsure whether a Spartan king could guarantee continuity. Rivals learned to wait, trusting that internal review might succeed where force had failed. Leadership was still present, authority was not. By the middle of the 5th century, Spartan kings ruled with a clear understanding of the stakes. To stand out was dangerous. To improvise was risky. To succeed too independently invited scrutiny that no victory could cancel. The ephors had not needed to seize power outright. They had taught kings how to limit themselves. What Sparta gained in control, it paid for in confidence. What it gained in predictability, it lost in initiative. Those costs were not immediately fatal, they were deferred, and when Sparta eventually faced moments that demanded speed, trust, and decisive command, the habits formed under surveillance would matter more than any law ever written. By the time Leotychides died in exile, Spartan kings understood the rules well enough to fear them. The question now was whether those rules could be bent without breaking the man who tried. One figure believed they could. Pausanias did not begin as a king, but as something more dangerous in Sparta's political system, a temporary ruler with extraordinary authority and a clear end date. After the death of King Leonidas, Pausanias governed as regent for the underage heir. In that role, he commanded armies without the usual dual-king constraints. For the first time in decades, Spartan leadership was concentrated in a single pair of hands. At first, the results were undeniable. In 479 BC, Pausanias led the Greek forces to victory over Persia at Plataea. The achievement placed him at the center of the Greek world. Allied commanders deferred to him. Cities honored him. His name carried weight beyond Sparta's borders. That visibility was intoxicating and dangerous. Pausanias began to act differently after the war. In dealings with Ionian cities, he ruled harshly, punishing dissent and issuing orders without consultation. Allies complained that he behaved less like a commander and more like a tyrant. Those complaints did not go unnoticed. The ephors summoned him home. This was the moment of adaptation. Pausanias did not resist. He returned to Sparta, submitted to review, and was formally acquitted of wrongdoing. On paper, the system worked. Oversight had been asserted. Authority had been restrained. But acquittal did not restore trust. Almost immediately, new accusations surfaced, this time far more serious. Pausanias was accused of communicating with Persian officials and plotting to undermine Spartan authority. According to later accounts, letters were intercepted. Testimony was gathered from helots and intermediaries. This was not a question of policy. It was a question of loyalty. Pausanias denied the charges. No decisive proof could be produced. The ephors hesitated. Executing a regent without certainty risked destabilizing the very system they claimed to protect. So Pausanias adapted again. He withdrew from public command. He lived quietly. He avoided confrontation. For a time, it seemed possible that he might survive by shrinking himself, by doing exactly what earlier kings had learned to do. Then the system shifted. According to tradition, a helot messenger revealed evidence that Pausanias intended to betray Sparta. Whether the plot was real or exaggerated mattered less than the response. This time the ephors acted decisively. They ordered his arrest. Pausanias fled to a sanctuary of Athena, seeking protection under sacred law. In earlier generations, that refuge might have delayed judgment indefinitely. Not now. The ephors sealed the sanctuary. They did not drag him out. They did not violate the temple. They waited. Pausanias, starved to death inside holy ground, removed without trial, without execution, without martyrdom. His body was taken out only when death was certain. The message was unmistakable. Adaptation did not guarantee safety. Withdrawal did not erase suspicion. Even victory over Persia could not outweigh fear of unchecked authority. This was the midpoint reversal. Up to now, the system had punished kings and ex-kings for specific actions: bribes, disputes, legitimacy, conduct. With Pausanias, the target shifted. The problem was no longer what a ruler did, it was what he might become. After Pausanias, Spartan leadership crossed a line it could not step back from. Potential threat mattered as much as proven guilt. Waiting became a weapon. Delay became judgment. Kings watching from the sidelines absorbed the lesson quickly. Success abroad increased danger at home. Prestige invited scrutiny. Exceptional authority demanded exceptional restraint. From this point forward, no Spartan king could believe that obedience alone would protect him. Even retreat carried risk. Even silence could be read as calculation. The system had proven it could destroy not only kings who resisted it, but rulers who tried to adapt within it. What followed would be harsher still, because fear no longer needed justification. After Pausanias died sealed inside a sanctuary, the rules hardened again. Suspicion no longer waited for proof. It waited for opportunity. The ephors had learned that fear could be administered without spectacle. Now they applied it openly. The next generation of kings faced a landscape where punishment was no longer exceptional. It was procedural. This shift becomes visible in the case of Pleistoanax. Pleistoanax inherited a kingship already thinned by precedent. His reign unfolded during a period of external pressure as Sparta struggled to contain revolts among its allies and confront the growing power of Athens. Decisions now carried immediate political risk on two fronts. In 446 BC, Pleistoanax led a Spartan army into Attica. The campaign had a clear objective: force Athens to abandon its influence in central Greece. The army advanced. Negotiations followed. Then, unexpectedly, Pleistoanax withdrew. The retreat ended the campaign without battle. On its face, the decision was defensible. Spartan forces remained intact. A prolonged war was avoided. But when Pleistoanax returned to Sparta, the ephors framed the withdrawal differently. They accused him of taking bribes from the Athenians. The charge did not hinge on whether the campaign could have succeeded. It focused on motive. Why withdraw at that moment? Why spare an enemy when pressure was working? The ephors brought the accusation before Spartan authorities. Pleistoanax was convicted in absentia. Before further penalties could be imposed, he fled into exile. His house was fined, his authority dissolved. For years, Sparta functioned without him. The punishment was public and humiliating. It reminded every king watching that strategic restraint could be retroactively transformed into corruption. What mattered was not the decision itself, but whether the ephors chose to accept its explanation. This was escalation. Earlier kings had been removed through religious doubt or questions of fitness. Pleistoanax was punished for judgement, specifically for choosing a course that reduced immediate risk but complicated the ephors' political position. The signal was unmistakable. Kings were no longer judged solely on outcomes. They were judged on alignment. Those who acted cautiously to avoid war risked accusations of betrayal. Those who pushed aggressively risked being labelled reckless or unstable. There was no safe middle ground. The ephors, meanwhile, remained insulated. Their authority was collective. Their terms were short. Responsibility for failure flowed downward, but scrutiny rarely travelled up. Over time, this imbalance normalised public humiliation as a tool of governance. Kings stood trial. Kings paid fines, kings fled. The office itself absorbed the shame. Even when Pleistoanax was later recalled from exile, the damage was permanent. His return did not restore confidence. It demonstrated that kingship could be suspended, paused and resumed at the system's discretion. Authority had become provisional. By now, the pattern was unmistakable to the Spartan citizen body. Kings were no longer symbols of continuity. They were liabilities to be managed. The ephors positioned themselves as guardians not just of law, but of acceptable leadership. That redefinition carried consequences beyond the courtroom. Military planning grew conservative. Kings avoided independent diplomacy. Decisions were delayed until ephor approval was explicit. Where earlier rulers had acted and then justified themselves, later kings sought permission in advance. This did not reduce tension, it redistributed it. Every delay created frustration among allies. Every hesitation invited challenge from rivals. Sparta still projected discipline, but its leadership increasingly moved at the speed of consensus rather than necessity. The system had succeeded in one respect. No king could dominate it, but success carried a cost. By normalizing the public punishment of kings, Sparta weakened the authority it depended on in moments of crisis. The throne no longer inspired confidence abroad or loyalty at home. It inspired calculation. Fear had become routine, and when fear becomes routine, escalation follows, because the system must punish more often to achieve the same effect. That escalation would soon bring Sparta to the edge of something it could not easily contain. By the late 5th century, the machinery that restrained Sparta's kings had begun to strain the system that built it. Fear was no longer a corrective, it was a constant. The consequences surfaced during the long, grinding pressures of the Peloponnesian War, when hesitation and internal review collided with the demands of rapid command. Sparta still needed kings to lead armies, negotiate alliances, and respond to crises, but it trusted them less than ever. That contradiction became visible in the reign of Agis II. Agis ruled during a period when Spartan decisions could not wait for consensus. Campaigns required speed, allies demanded reassurance, enemies exploited delay. Yet every move Agis made unfolded under the shadow of ephor scrutiny. In 419 BC, Agis led a Spartan army into Argive territory. The campaign stalled. Facing unfavorable terrain and uncertain allies, Agis chose to withdraw rather than force a battle. The decision was tactical. It also became political. When he returned to Sparta, the ephors did not debate whether the retreat was sound. They questioned whether Agis had acted without proper authorization. The issue was no longer judgment in the field. It was obedience at home. Agis was fined. More damagingly, his authority was curtailed. The ephors appointed a board of advisors to accompany him on future campaigns, effectively placing the king under supervision while in command. Orders now passed through intermediaries. Decisions slowed, responsibility blurred. The army noticed. Allies noticed too. They began negotiating with Spartan commanders directly, unsure whether the king's word would hold. Rivals learned that Spartan leadership could be stalled not by force, but by internal review. Agis adapted by narrowing his actions. He sought ephor approval before major moves. He avoided independent negotiation. He chose caution where speed might have served better. The system interpreted this compliance as success. The war did not. As pressure mounted, distrust began flowing upward as well. Ephors questioned not only kings, but the outcomes of their own restraints. Delays produced losses, losses demanded blame. The kings remained the most visible targets. The cycle tightened, kings acted cautiously. Caution produced setbacks. Setbacks justified further oversight. No single decision caused collapse. The damage came from accumulation. By this stage, the ephors were no longer merely restraining kings. They were shaping command behavior in ways that reduced flexibility at precisely the moment flexibility mattered most. Leadership existed, but it was fragmented. Authority was present, but conditional. Sparta's citizen body sensed the contradiction. The state demanded decisive leadership, while punishing decisiveness that fell outside approved bounds. Trust eroded on both sides. Kings feared review. Ephors feared autonomy. The system began consuming its own confidence. Agis survived his reign, but survival was no longer proof of effectiveness. It meant only that he had avoided crossing lines that were never fully defined. The office he held had been transformed into something narrower, more constrained and less trusted than at any point in its history. By now, the danger was no longer that a king might grow too powerful. The danger was that no one could act freely enough when it mattered. Sparta had succeeded in making power unsafe. It was beginning to discover what that safety cost. The question was no longer whether the system could restrain kings. It was whether a state built on restraint could still respond to crisis without tearing itself apart. The system that Sparta built to restrain its kings did not collapse in a single moment. It wore them down instead, quietly, repeatedly, and with increasing certainty. By the early 4th century, the damage was no longer confined to individual reigns. It was visible in outcomes. Sparta still fielded armies. It still issued commands. But the confidence that once made those commands decisive had thinned to procedure. The final proof came not through another exile or trial, but through defeat. In 371 BC, a Spartan army marched north under King Cleombrotus III. The objective was straightforward: confront Theban forces and reassert Spartan dominance in central Greece. The march itself revealed how much had changed. Cleombrotus did not act freely. He operated under political constraints, contested authority, and expectations shaped by decades of surveillance. At Leuctra, the Theban general Epaminondas exploited that rigidity. His forces advanced in an unconventional formation, concentrating strength where Spartan doctrine expected symmetry. Cleombrotus hesitated, the kind of hesitation that comes from years of looking over your shoulder. The result was catastrophic. Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting. Hundreds of Spartan citizens fell with him. For the first time in generations, Sparta lost a major land battle in open confrontation. The loss at Leuctra was not just military, it was structural. Sparta's reputation for inevitability shattered. Allies defected. Subject cities revolted. The myth of Spartan invincibility, carefully maintained for centuries, collapsed in a single afternoon. No ephor stood trial for the defeat. No collective body was fined or exiled. The cost landed where it always had. On the king, on the office. What followed confirmed the long-term consequence of making power unsafe. Sparta struggled to adapt. Decision-making slowed further as leaders feared blame more than failure. Kings could no longer command loyalty beyond Sparta's borders because no one believed they spoke with final authority. By eliminating the possibility of a dominant king, Sparta also eliminated the possibility of decisive leadership when its survival depended on it. Surveillance replaced trust, procedure replaced judgment, fear replaced initiative. This was the final irony. Sparta had designed its kingship as a controlled danger, something to be constantly watched and corrected. Over time, that design reshaped the men who held the crown, and eventually reshaped the state itself. Kings learned not how to rule boldly, but how to endure. They learned how to avoid notice, not how to seize moments. When a moment finally arrived that demanded speed, confidence, and autonomy, the system had trained those qualities out of existence. Sparta did not fall because it trusted its kings too much. It declined because it never trusted them at all. By turning kingship into one of the most dangerous positions in the Greek world, Sparta preserved itself for generations, but at a cost that only became clear when fear could no longer substitute for leadership. The Watchers had done their job, and in doing so, they ensured that no Spartan king was ever safe, including the ones who needed to be. They had built a system that could survive bad kings. They never considered what would happen when it needed a good one.